welcome back. Please have a seat. We're going to start the second half of this very interesting symposium so far. Our next speaker is a distinguished speaker, Xu Chenggang. Xu Chenggang is Professor of Economics at CKGSB and a board member of the Ronald Coase Institute, as well as a research fellow with the CEPR. Professor Xu received his PhD from Harvard University. He then taught at Harvard, London School of Economics, University of Hong Kong, Seoul National University, and a long list of leading business schools. In fact, last year, Professor Xu Chenggang received China's most prestigious 2016 Economics Award from the National Economics Foundation. Today, Professor Xu Chenggang will look at China's economy, both its potential and challenges. Please welcome Professor Xu Chenggang.
大家好。
Good afternoon. I take great delight to share with you my view on China's economic development. Actually, before me, two speakers shared with you most of the information which are complementary to what I'm going to talk about later. And I will give you an even bigger picture of China's economy because we want to know in what might be the potential drivers for China's economic growth down the road. And first of all, I want to share with you some statistics. Actually, I make a very big table here. It is a cross-border and also with historical records. What I want to tell you by this table is the relative economic development between countries. Any single country comparison to the other countries at the same time frame, and we are measured by per capita GDP. Therefore, every country is calculated by its per capita GDP divided by the most advanced country's GDP per capita of that time. If the ratio is 1, which means that he is the top country within that time frame. So China, you may see, China was one quarter of the global economic status. Let's look at China's from the 1850 to 2016. Probably you know that 1850, the end of the Opium War. Ever since the Opium War, China's economy dramatically falling to 1950, making China the poorest country in the world. And such kind of situation persisted for 3 decades. If we look at China's data, only people believe that from 1850 to 1950, you believe China's economy enjoyed very good economic development. But why China's relative economic comparison maintained the same? Because all the other countries are moving forward. Therefore, in comparison sense, your country has made very slight change. In the modern history, when did China's economy move up forward? That was after reform and opening up. Ever since the reform and opening up, you may see nowadays China's economic development is 1/5 of the global top country. Why I give you 2 columns here? This one is estimated by myself. The previous data is calculated based on the world-famous historians, and all this column is measured by myself. So my estimation is made of these 2 columns. What I want to highlight here is to compare China and Korea. Why? Because we want to know how far China's economy will grow. Let's look at the comparative development of China's economy. That is in the 1980s or the end of the 1970s for South Korea. As known to all, from the end of the 1970s until not long ago, South Korea enjoyed a very fast expansion of its economy. Therefore, this was the 1980s. In the middle, you can see South Korea enjoyed very good growth. Let's compare China to Japan. And you can see that Japan in its 1950s was close to the situation of China now. After 1950s, Japan's development was quite good. I want to show you this data. I want to tell you that we can have a clear picture what is the baseline of China's economic situation in comparison to different countries by the time sequence. China is still a country in its early stage of economic development and not very good yet. This is good news to us. Why? You may see Japan and South Korea as a good example. China still has its good potential to grow itself. The next question is that if China has a huge potential to grow itself, what are the drivers? How to find out these drivers? And in the economic series, we know that in the economic development, there are three important things. The first important thing is your capital investment, land investment, labor cost input. The second one is the technological progress. The third one is your institution or your system. I should say technological changes and institution. In measuring the economic growth are difficult to make distinction. Therefore, in our measurement, we incorporate them into the one we call it a total factor productivity. And it includes both technology, management, and institution. Now we want to focus on, from the opening up and the reform, the TFP's contribution to China's growth. So the gray bar represents the TFNP, the proportion of the TMP, and then in GDP. And also we can see since we start reform and opening up and all the way towards several years ago, they have the very positive contribution. However, in recent several years, we are seeing a different story. We're actually seeing a negative contribution of the TFNP. We all know that in the recent years, from the management and from technology, there is no possible to see such a negative contribution. So that means what caused the negative impact, which is the institutional factors. So there were a lot of obstacles and limitations that caused that the technology investment and the material investment were actually generated negative impact, and that is a huge issue. And that means for the TFNP, when the contribution become a negative one, and then we have a very big issue. And I need to emphasize that this is not my research results. This is actually the research result of Professor Wei and Professor Zhang Xiaowei, and it is one of the findings of their research of this year. And now I want to briefly talk about my key points. So from the statistics, and we already see one of the evidence when we talk about potential of China's development and how to fully unleash our potential. The key is to solve an institutional problem. So the first evidence was the statistics I draw from McKinsey's research, and we actually have similar results from the different institutions. And I just used one of them, and according to this data, it shows that the labor productivity compared with the OECD countries. That means the most developed economies all over the world. So that means compare with the global market economies, our labor productivity is not only 15% to 30% of the OECD's average level.
And this inefficiency, which is lower than the developed economy for 2 or 3 times, that means the problem is not the technical problems, and because this is a very prevalent problem. And also there is another research findings that is in line with these calculations. We also calculate the units and the labor productivity, and we find that the units and the labor cost is at the similar level of the States and also the Western European countries. And obviously we are seeing that the units and the labor cost is very high in China, and that is directly related to the very low labor productivity. So that means the units and the labor payroll is very low, and that means the productivity level is very low, and then also caused by other factors. That means that every employee you've hired, and besides paying is the wage, there were other factors that may cost the overall high cost on the labor. And here we do not really emphasize the content issues. We emphasize the reasons why we have such a high labor cost. And we believe that the reason may lie in the institutional issue. And there is another very related ratio, which is the household income. So we are seeing the household income, the total household income in China, and the proportion of the GDP, and which is actually indexed and to check and compares. And we may find that in China, the proportion of the total family income is only 1/3 of the total GDP. So that means our still of domestic demands, and there were two common reasons behind whether it is caused by overcapacity or other issues. But if we combine or considering the total household income, and we still believe that it is the mirror that can reflect the phenomenon. And when the household have a very low income, that means the government has a very high income. In the past several years, and every year the government's revenues and increase the rates and overpassed the GDP growth rate. So that means every year the government is taking a very big pie from a very big part from the cake. So that means the very high government income and is an aggregate income may cause the very low domestic demands. And within this context, we can say that the labor and the enterprises in China has been shouldering the very big cost of the institutional problem. And so if we check the reasons and the measures which intend to drive the economic development in China, so whether it can work, and if it is focused on the frontier industrial upgrade, you will believe that this kind of measures cannot solve the issue at all. The reason is, even though we've channeled the whole effort and devoted into the most frontier and industrial upgradings, now we may only solve the problem. So some specific and very few enterprises, because we cannot solve the economic problems with this kind of resource allocation, and the economic issues will be solved on the market with level ground competition. So we are facing a common issue, and for common issues, it will be solved by solving the institutional issues. And also, and even we only focus on the industrial upgrading itself, we need to see whether industrial upgradings may work or not. And it may only work when we solve the institutional issues. And due to the time limitations, now I cannot just elaborate on all these items, but now I want to show you some statistics to support my idea. So on the left, it is the most profitable industry, And on the right is the most profitable industry in these states. So as you can see clear from this comparison, the most profitable industry in China is only one, banking sector. And however, in these days, there were a lot of very profitable enterprise industries, and the banking sector is not only ranked as the number one. And when we see the economic potentials of a certain country, it depends on your real economy and not only the banking sector, because the financing sector provides service for the real economy. And however, also you can see the banking sectors are taking a great profit from the economy. So when we're talking about the institutional issues, this is actually a very obvious evidence to show, to reflect these and institutional issues. So this is the most profitable public enterprises, and we've also compared the Asia market with the U.S. stock market. And as you can see, the top several ones are banks, as well as the SOEs, and they are monopoly enterprises. And as you can see from the U.S. situation, so basically they are enterprises from the real economy. So we may realize that this very severe problem. So for example, how about Alibaba and Tencent, which is listed on the overseas markets? The reason is very simple, and they want to be listed on the overseas markets because of the institutional issues, and they are actually finding an institute and a system that is suit and match their development overseas. And that can greatly reflect the problem. And for this statistics, it also supports one of the points I just mentioned, which is the high government revenue against the GDP. And also you can see the physical revenues to GDP has been improving from the 1990s all the way towards the recent years. And here we're talking about the proportion of the government revenues against the GDP. And that's my screw and crowding out the proportion of the domestic demands, which is the family household income. And so for here, this number, the dashed line on the top represents the global average number, and the shadowed shapes represent the confidence, the range of this statistics. So that means statistically, and for the data within this the range, and that it is in line with the 6 rules. However, this is China, and the horizontal and this number represents the household consumptions against the GDP, and the horizontal is actually the GDP per capita. And whether it is a poor or rich country, the proportion is actually quite similar. And however, China is in a very special case. Now, when China become the richer from the poor country, and you are actually seeing a very low percentage of the household consumptions against the GDP. And so when China become a richer country, the more richer, the more government may have the revenue, and we are talking about still non-percentage, not an absolute number. So as the result, very simple, you are seeing the very, very weak domestic consumption. And another data is the increasing number of the leverage rate. And for the vertical axis, so we are actually seeing the change in the debt to GDP ratio, and we are seeing the negative and also the positive percentage. And for the horizontal one, it is the leverage ratio in itself. So that means that to the right side, you have a higher rate of leverage ratio, and also that means the very fast income. So this is the location of China. So this location means that if we only count the leverage ratio, which is calculated by the national debt divided by the GDP, if we only check about this ratio simply, China do have quite a high number, but not too high. However, if you check the change of the increase of the leverage ratio, that means it has a very, very high number on a global scale, and that is a very big problems that people concerned. And now let's talk about the debt and who actually own the debt. And also this is the national LFV, and which taken a very huge share of the national debt, the LFV. And this is the research conducted by Professor Bai, Xie, and Song in Tsinghua University and Chicago University and Hong Kong Chinese University. And they've conducted this research recently. They used a very smart way to calculate the local financing vehicle and how many debt they've raised. And during the time limitation, I will not talking about the details, but as you can see, the up the line is the total debt raised by the LFV, and which is about 45 trillion yuan. And that is by the end of 2012, and this number is increasing, and this number is much higher than the official statistics. And I'm not saying that who is lying, but actually it is because the number, it is really hard to be obtained, but they use very good and smart measures to calculate into this number. And also another very important issue is the balance, the budgetary balance of China. If you check about the official number, and you are actually seeing quite good surplus from the official number, and we believe that it is very healthy and sound. And however, if you calculate all the numbers together, including the central government and the local government, and you are actually seeing the deficits. And if you combine all the data together, and to have the very close an inspection of this data, you are actually seeing this line. And when we combine all the numbers together, both the central governments and also the local government, you actually may see a very, very big deficit, and this deficit is increasing. And then on the other side, since we've talking about the debt issue, and we are going to talk about the leverage ratio of an SOE and the private sector, and we are actually seeing an increasing leverage ratio of an SOEs, and also a decreasing trend for the leverage ratios of the public sector. And this is quite related to Professor Gan's research. And also this is the real estate, and real estate has a very high debt level, and we are also seeing the industries of overcapacities, and also showing the increasing rate of the debt in the leverage ratio. And this is another number showing and reflects that the infrastructure-related industry and the real estate industry is also raising a lot of debt. So we are seeing that we are having a very high debt level, and this is the cause. And also the relationship between the SOEs and the private sector. We're just talking about the debts, and that is directly related to their financing cost. And for this part of this number, and you can actually see the blue line represents the private enterprises, and the red line represents the central-owned and state-owned enterprises. And also you can see that the private sectors have great difficulties on financing, and it's really hard for them to borrow the money. And when we're talking about infrastructures and the real estate, if you are an SOE, and then your strict price on the line will be very low. And however, if you are private sector, you are going to pay the market price, and the price difference is in several times. And for this number, it shows that for all the firms, and this is the left up corner is for all the firms, is the ratio of the debt to revenue, and also we're comparing it with all the manufacturing firms. And as you can see from this full chart, all the listed enterprises in the recent years and have a very high ratio of the debt to revenue. However, for other enterprises, generally speaking, their debt ratio is actually decreasing. And for the overall economy, we are keep saying that the debt house will become a very severe ratio, but actually it is only a part of the enterprises and part of the economy have this kind of issues. And they are local governments, listed companies, and also the SOEs, especially those ones that focus on the real estate and infrastructure and construction sector. And for this slide, we basically talking about is the percentage of ROA, and that means when they borrow the money, whether they have the capacity of paying it back. So we are seeing industrial private enterprises and the SOEs and as well as the local SOEs. As you can see, for the private enterprises, they actually have much higher capacities obtaining returns. And just here we've calculated your revenues and divided by your assets. And if we check this diagram closely, and we need to compare the nominal ROEs with the real ROEs. The blue line is the nominal ROE, and the right line represents the real ROE. As you can see, there is a big gap. And the most important thing is not only about the gap. If we check about the real ROE, so basically for most ROE and listed ROE, for most listed ROEs are actually losing money. And if we calculate the real ROE, but not their nominal ones, and they're actually losing money. And this work is conducted by Professor Xu Xiaonian and his assistants. And this report and the survey is also providing specific information for different sectors. And when we talk about potential of China's economy, and we are seeing that China has been involved and from the poor country into the low or mid-income country. And our next question is whether we may have the low-income trap, and whether we may fall into the mid-income trap, and whether we have the better performance than the low-income countries. So here, if we compare those countries that may successfully get rid of this mid-income trap, there is no one common feature is that they do have a very high penetration rate of education, and one of the index is the high school education. If we check the high school penetration rate, and we may find that for China, among all the mid-income nations, we actually have the lowest high school penetration index, and here is an issue. And when we're talking about institutional problems, it actually include the education issue. And in China, the high school penetration rate is way too low, and this very low penetration rate on the high school education decides that we cannot provide a very high quality in the labor. And this is why our labor cost is very high, while our labor productivity is very low. So this is the reason. And let's compare the situation in Korea. And we already compared Korea, and we say that our economy is similar to Korea by the end of the 1970s. Now let's compare the high school penetration rate in Korea.
In China's cities nowadays, the secondary education prevalence was very close to that in Korea, but the biggest problem comes from the rural areas. In rural areas, the prevalence of the secondary education was a little bit higher than 1/3. But in Korea, the prevalence of the secondary education was the same between the urban and the rural areas. Only when you have a balanced secondary education between rural areas, you can mention that you can become in an middle-income country with a good motivation for the labor force. Without a proper labor force, you will have upcoming problems. The last question is about innovation. I know I'm running out of time. Vertically, is the innovation index, the higher it is, means that it has a higher ranking in innovation. Horizontally, it is the per capita GDP, indicating the economic development of the country. China is right here. If we look at per capita GDP, China is a middle developed country, but in terms of innovation, we are quite high up in the ranking. The other countries you may see above us are all advanced countries. In appearance, that China's innovation capability is relatively good internationally, but there are some details open for discussion. One of the details is that the highest scoring for China are the two. You may see this one is about the secondary or middle school education. You may see China's secondary education ranks the highest, but the year before last, China was the highest. You may see that how do they calculate such a indicator? And this one is about the top 3 universities ranking among the whole world, and China ranks number 4 worldwide. Well, I will not go into details. Probably you already know what I want to say. Many people quote such a ranking saying that China's innovation is so strong. We really want to focus on what this parameters or index mean. If this rankings is like this, you may have a suspicion in your mind. And where does China lose score? That is the institutional or system. You may see that China ranks very low worldwide. And the other very big issue is the recent patent application number, which keeps growing. Internationally, there is an argument whether China now is taking off in its R&D. Just now, we also talked about TFP, which includes technology. If we look at domestic patent application, highlighted by the red line, above that it's Japan, this is USA. You may see many years ago or 10 years ago, the domestic patent application number surpassed all the other countries in the world. Another very interesting phenomenon, Japan is always running ahead of USA. Look at innovation worldwide. There is no changes. USA is always, innovation is better in Japan, in USA than Japan. But in terms of a patent number, Japan is always ahead of USA. If we measure by the number of the patent number, you need to have such a question mark in your mind. What is this ranking about? This is my last slide. Here, I quote Professor Hu is located in Singapore. He published one paper this year. This is the data of China's Bureau of Patents. And to make a comparative analysis, he made a calculation. If I have overall patent numbers, all the numbers of the companies, if we combine them together, I want to see if patent application is beneficial to their TFP, but there is no relevance at all. Why? Because in China, as known to all of us here know this, the governments at all levels have their own incentives or motivations to encourage you to file up for more application for patents. But you know why the companies want to do the R&D or they want to apply for the patent? Originally, motivation is to make money, to uplift your productivity. But when a policy is to invite them to apply for more patents, this is a market distortion behavior. Therefore, the number of patent numbers is not relevant to the productivity at all. This is my final last page. And the most severe challenge to us is the problems we want to address. It is all about institutional issues, such as the physical policies. For example, we need to greatly cut the revenue, try to enhance the income of the households families among the GDP, but we cannot fulfill that goal within a short span of time. But this is one of our goal. Otherwise, China's economic growth is having no motivation or drivers by the purchase power. China is already #1, and we can only rely on the internal demand. The internal demand means the aggregated household demand. If the household family income is only 1/3, there is no driver for growth. On the other hand, we need to improve the market institution system, and the core issue is about the soft constraint of the state-owned assets. Due to time constraint, I will not go into details. Finally, it's the innovation. We have a series of institutional problems relevant to innovation. Only when we are able to address them, we can possibly have innovation and the R&D efficiency. Thank you, Professor Xu. Thank you for your wonderful sharing. Now we move to the discussion of the session. I'd like to invite the guests for this discussion, and they are Professor Xu Chenggang, Professor of Economics, CKGSB, Kevin Kong, Chief Economist, KPMG China, Dean of China Academy of New Supply Side Economics, Chairman of China Soft Capital, CKGSB alumnus, Wang Guangyu, Professor of Economics, and also Rachel Maraji, Director of the Economist Corporate Network. The floor is yours.
Everyone, I know we have to finish at 6, so I am going to try and do this panel in English, but if people get stuck, I will do my best to understand everybody's Chinese. Perhaps if I could start by just I'll start with Kevin and work inwards, to ask basically where do we see, we've had a lot of big picture macro data, some really interesting stuff. Where do you see the opportunities in the Chinese economy in the next year or two, and where do you see the risks?
Okay, so maybe let me start with the risk. So I do think there are 3 major risks for the Chinese economy in the recent term. So the first one will be the real estate market. So I think the real estate markets probably will see some slowdown next year. So then if the real market slows down, I think that will have a big impact on the overall economy. The second risk will be on the deleveraging or the liquidity issue in China. So we know Chinese government has been taking measures to reduce leverage in recent months. So if the government taking the liquidity reduction too fast or too quickly, then probably will have a big impact on the overall economy growth. And the third factor, I think, will be on the transition in China. So we know China, also I think that's also an opportunity for the Chinese economy. So right now, the economy is a transition from growth, most focused on the quantity or the speed, to a more high quality growth. So if the Chinese government Chinese economy can make the transition successfully, I think there will be a major opportunity for the Chinese economy in the future. Okay.
We talked a little bit about the 19th Party Congress, and President Xi Jinping did move away when he talked about 2035. He moved away from an absolute growth target, but I mean, it does. Are we still in the era of growth targets for the next couple of years? And what risks does that bring with it, do you think, Professor Xu?
Okay, as an economist, I regard our job is more like a medical doctor to diagnose the problems. So if I diagnose, then here we can separate symptom from the source of the sickness. So if we only look at the symptoms, then what we see is a high leverage and slowing down in growth, overcapacity, so on and so forth. So all of these are symptoms. But if we look at where these problems come from, so then here, as I just quickly mentioned, one of the biggest problems is the so-called soft budget constraint problem associated with state-owned firms and local governments. And the so-called soft budget constraint problem means that when they become insolvent, they don't go bankruptcy. But as long as they understand that there's no risk of going bankruptcy, then they become very bold in borrowing. And so what we have been seeing in the recent nearly 10 years is exactly what this is driving. Right? So the local governments and the state enterprises, they borrow. So if we look at the short run, then I believe that the probability of having financial crisis or physical crisis in the short run, the likelihood is low. The reason is because still the central government has ammunitions to deal with. But on the other hand, you also see that they are consuming their ammunitions. So gradually, the ammunitions are going to run out. So once you run out of the ammunitions, then you really face the trouble, the deep trouble. Actually, the stability issue is closely related to economic growth. These two, you don't just choose between the two. So when the growth comes down, all the other problems become more serious. So when you have a high growth rate, then it's much easier to solve other problems. So these are actually a pair. You don't really have a trade-off. So when the growth is facing a basic challenge, and at the same time, they realize that the stability is a big issue, this challenge is tremendous. So it's not just slowing down would solve the problem. Slowing down is not going to solve the problem automatically.
We've seen some moves towards financial reform in the last few months and since Party Congress. Have we seen anything in the bond market that reflects a differing borrowing cost between state companies and private companies? I mean, for a long time, most state companies were regarded as quasi-sovereign. I mean, there was no, the market quite clearly saw that there was an implicit guarantee. Is there any move on that front, or are people still waiting to see?
Right. Okay. The bond market in China is underdeveloped. So the regulation is very tight for firms to issue bonds, and particularly even more tight vis-a-vis the local governments. The local governments were not allowed to issue bonds. So under such a underdeveloped situation and tight regulation, I guess the data from the bond market would not reflect the reality. And when we talk about debts, most of the debts are bank loans. And even, actually, I didn't have time to elaborate. It's even more dangerous when we look at the nature of the debts that China accumulated. Simply because most of the debts are not only bank loans, these are collaterals. And collateral, they use land as collateral. So all of these are pro-cyclical. So when something goes wrong, that's why growth is tied up with the stability. So when something goes wrong in growth, and then the land price would come down. So when land prices come down, then the value of collaterals will come down. And then the quality of the balance sheet of all the banks would deteriorate. So then you are in trouble.
Well, at least not for a couple of years, at least for a while. Now, for the supply side reform, you're the head of a think tank. You have spent some time thinking about it, and quite clearly that's one of the success stories of the last year. Where has it succeeded, and where is there still work to do?
Thank you for the question. maybe answer in Chinese is very well. 我来用中文回答。
I try to understand this question in Chinese. So supplier side for reform is really a topical issue in China. Just now, the professors gave us mentioned the debt issue in China's macro economy. Actually, debt has become the top concern in China's economy. Professors showed some statistics not long ago. I also saw the data provided by the Renmin University professor, and he measured from another perspective the overall debt by the end of last year was 255%. Of course, it is high above the peso crisis, 77% of the Mexico, and also Thailand, 118% of the Thailand baht, close to the 2009 U.S. debt level, 238%, a little bit lower than the Spain ratio that is 262%. 255% over debt ratio is very, very high. Many investors or financial professionals keep discussing this, and when will be the debt market or bond market cannot see the insolvency and also the loss of liquidity, and the other perspective just the lady mentioned. And under the supply side reform, and we do see that macroly speaking, is quite stable and it looks quite good. And yes, the debt issue in China is so serious to impact our growth of the economy or impact our economic structure and the policy selection. For example, the 3 reduction and the 1 make up, what are the key factors which are playing an important role? Simply speaking, when we focus on the supply side reform, we talked about destock and decapacity. People show more concern on the decapacity. The large commodity price is the result of decapacity. But principally speaking, the most important research topic for us is the deleveraging. I believe that in the real economy and the financial fields, we really focus on the deleveraging. And I believe it has a greater implication on the industrial economy and the financial market. Just now, Professor mentioned 1 reduction and 1 make up our shortcomings. And we know that in our real economy, we know the innovation, technology, the reduction of the TFP, and how to face up to the new source of labor cost, and how to make up of the shortcoming. As a matter of fact, I do some detailed work in my day-to-day operation, and my view on China's macroeconomy is less pessimistic, but we really need to deepen our reform to avoid bigger problems.
In terms of opportunities, so we've talked a lot about risks. I mean, where do you see the biggest potential for growth?
我首先刚才可能补充一下那个王先生。
One thing I also need to add about the debt issue, I really wanted to also add something. I think the debt issue in China was the most severe by the end of the last year. And then also, as Professor mentioned, and also you just mentioned, is about 222%, which is similar to the state's level. And according to the Q2's data, and this number is actually improved compared with the end of the last year, but the improvement was not really big. And also, we are seeing the very good recovery of very good improvement and of the debt issue. And also, we've conducted some research and with many SOEs and the debt level and the leverage ratio has also been improved. And for many industries, like the mining industry, now, of course, the leverage ratio is still very high, and it is becoming even higher. And however, for many other industries, their debt ratios and also their leverage ratios has been improved. So debt issue is the key issue for China. But I still believe that the general and overall economic development is still quite optimistic because the Chinese government have been taking very effective measures to solve the issue. And this 225%, that is very high. However, for Japan, and their percentage is about 300%. And their economy situation is actually quite stable and good. After 20 to 30 years of the reform, and at least for the common people, and their welfare was not actually deteriorated, and there is no economic recession. So this 250 something percent, it is a very severe issue, but I do not believe that this may just drive China's economy into a very bad condition. And also, let's come back to the opportunity. You asking about an opportunity, and we believe that the upgrading of the consumption and an upgrading of an export structure, as well as the upgrading of the financial structures, will pose the new opportunities for the economic development. And many conventional industry are transforming themselves to become an innovative sector, and also Tencent has already become the number 5 in the companies with the highest net value, and but this is just not what as the Professor Xu just mentioned. These companies choose to get listed in the overseas market instead of Asia, and there will still be some institutional issues. And we believe that the transition of China's economy will also keep bringing new opportunities to us. And also, as we've mentioned, that the state-owned enterprises and the central-owned enterprises is still the main driver of China's economy, and they mainly focus on the energy and power, as well as the water sector, and that may bring some spaces for the new innovation like the internet and the AI, and they will become the future driving forces of the future economic development, and that creates a very good space for the private sector for their further development.
What Kevin was saying, how do you stop the state sector soaking up capital that could go to more productive uses? I mean, what can, because what we've seen is kind of things going in the opposite direction.
Well, actually, about the SOEs and the reform of the SOEs, it is actually an old issue, an old topic. And nowadays, we are still talking about the old issues, however, in a new way, with the new symptoms. And all over the world, the reform of the SOEs in many other countries, we actually can learn a lot of the experiences and lessons from other countries in terms of the reform of the SOEs and how to solve this kind of soft budget restraint. And we really need to transform its ownership. If we do not really change its ownership, and we are still going to suffer from this soft budget restraint issue. So from the economic principles, it is very clear. And in the past 10 years, and we learned these lessons from the more than dozens of countries. And there is no doubt that the transformation of an SOE, in order to solve this soft budget restraint issue, we need to face the ownership issue, because the core issue is, and it needs to have the risk of bankruptcy. And only when they may face the bankruptcy, the senior managers, when they are borrowing money, they will be very cautious. If there is no bankruptcy, and they will be very bold. And they may try to take different measures, like the overcapacity, and after they have the issues. However, if we do not really curb their investment, passionate when they borrow the money, there is no way that we can solve this issue, especially with the big SOEs. Then their appointment of the senior managers were actually appointed by the central government. And today they can be the senior manager of the SOE, or maybe tomorrow they can become like the governor of a certain city. So they do not really shoulder the responsibility of issuing the debts. So this is not why the reform of an SOE should be traced back to the issue of ownership. It is the very actual core. And when we are facing this kind of debt decision makings, and we cannot have this kind of ownership, and we need to let the business markets play the role, to let the financial market play the role, and to make the market play the real role. So they may start to concern whether they are a good manager or not. They will not have the expectations like today I'm the senior manager of an SOE and tomorrow I may become the mayor or the governor of a certain city or a province.
And we've also seen that the government is now sort of investing in private equity funds. What do you think the role of the state and then also the role of private equity and private capital will be in pushing on innovation, and how will those two things cooperate together?
So I'm going to talk about the story. I want to share a story with you. And this is actually followed up in the stories with the last two slides from Professor Xu. And you actually made some statistics on the patent number. And we are actually doing a lot of statistics on the number of the patent we do have in our own business, which is providing and then providing the funds for the startups. So we actually use the big data to help them to screen all different patents to see whether there were some potential ones that can be transformed into the real results. We find that there were two very interesting phenomena, and I want to share it with you. So if you if you check the patent, you actually can see a lot of the U.S. universities, and they do have the patent in China. If you check the Harvard University or Stanford universities, and their patent in China, they actually can transform the patent into the real business, and which is quite in line with the U.S. companies and business line. However, if you check the universities like the Tsinghua universities and also in China Science Academy universities, you may find it is basically research-based, and which is hard to be transformed into the marketable products. So I want to answer your question for the innovation. Government-based fund and also the policy guidance may probably do not really play a very big role on the innovation and in business. So probably we really need to give this market, give this space to the market to let the young people and to let entrepreneurs who chase the real returns to play a bigger role. So for the VC and PE, it is a high risk. It's a very high risk sector, but we are also seeing a high return. Sometimes we only see the high return perspective because it's still at an early stage and we do not really establish a very mature institute and policies. And we are seeing a lot of the VCPs earning a great amount of money, but this sector, this business is actually in high return, high risk. And this property and this nature decides that the government budgets cannot or should not be used as the VCP. And I believe that the mission of the government is to use their budgets to solve the guarantee of the market. And if it plays very well, and we're actually competing and the benefit with the private sector. And if it is not really good, we're actually wasting the taxpayers' money. So my personal opinion is that the government funds should not compete with the private. And of course, we have the different financing methods or different funds and to support the innovation. And there is great motivations behind it. And we still believe that we really need the time and also some failure cases to let everybody believe that this kind of way is not efficient enough. Of course, we all hope that we want to have our own Silicon Valley and we want to develop Shenzhen or Beijing to turn into its new Silicon Valley. But we know that behind the Silicon Valley there is comprehensive types of capital markets like Wall Street. And however, as Professor just mentioned, that there are already a lot of the experience and proof that an ISOE actually do not really play an important role on promoting innovation. So this is actually an issue related to the reform of the financial institute. And how can we let the private capital to participate the financing sectors? and do not let the financing sector become a monopolized sector. And we really wanted to let the private players to enter into this market and to provide more preferable tax and to the private sector.
刚才那个王先生这说的我非常同意。
And I truly agree with Mr. Wang, and I want to add two things. And there is a diagram mentioned by Professor Xu, which is very good. And the number of the patents was also was really high and overpassed the state's number. And we also did the relevant research, and because we are seeing a very big number of patent, and we did a research and among the A-share companies and want to know which industry may contribute the greatest patent number. And before that, we assumed that maybe the high-tech companies may have the greatest number of the patent, so we've checked about their annual report. However, our finding was to our surprise, among the A-share company, you just couldn't guess which company actually have the biggest patent number. Is actually steel company. And so I just talked with my analyst. Did we get the wrong number? However, we double-checked it for several times. But actually, steel companies actually generated and contributed the greater numbers of the patents. And I thought it was be CECT or other or higher, which is the more technology-oriented enterprises, and this can be traced back to what Professor Xu just mentioned. The number of the patents may not be in a very good index to assess or measure our capacity of innovation, and the number of the patent is actually driven by the policies and relevant regulations. And also, as Mr. Wang just mentioned, industrial policy and what is its role, or whether the industrial policy may play a big role on driving the innovation. There were a lot of funds investing industries like the new materials, whether they are playing a very important role. And from our perspective as an economist, and we've trained and from the market economy, and so deep in our mind, we believe that this kind of regulations from the government side do not really have a big role on driving the innovation. We can see a lot of the failure cases from Japan. And however, one of the cases we are seeing clearly in China in the past 20 to 30 years, and China did have very good policies which can encourage the innovation. And there is a huge dilemma because simply from our assumptions, and this kind of the regulations shouldn't play a big role. But we are seeing a very successful story from China. So there will be some leapfrogging effect, some follower effect for some industries like the automobile industries and the diesel engine industry, as well as the inner combustion engine industry. And we've studied this for quite a while. We can learn a lot of experiences from the States, from Germany, and we can use a very good policy to drive the development of such an industry. And however, we keep innovating. And there were a lot of new sectors like AI and internet. We are actually at the world's frontier, and we do not really have many experiences to learn from, and we are actually losing this kind of followers effect, and that means this kind of industrial policies is playing a smaller role. In the past, it's very busy. In the past, it's very easy. We just learn from others' experience. But now we do not have previous experience to draw, so we believe that the policy will play smaller role. So how to recognize this effect and how to do an adjustment based on such an effect. And theoretically speaking, the industrial policies shouldn't play such a big role. So we also need to change our mindset. In the past, those policies that may work probably in the future may not working anymore.
Example of state capital funding all sorts of research that was then commercialized. But the commercializing was not done by the government. I mean, that's maybe the big difference. There are certain things that the state can do very well that private capital doesn't do in the same way. A slightly different question for you now about consumption. Perhaps Professor Xu, and then we can see who else wants to take it up before we finish. Consumption has held up very strongly over the last couple of years. I mean, there's every reason to think that it will continue to do so. How much of consumption growth here is linked back to the property market? I mean, if you look at like pre-2007 in the West, you know, what drove consumption was people's feeling of being rich, and what made them feel rich was rising house prices. How vulnerable is China to that kind of correction?
很好的问题。
It's a very good question. Well, actually, in my presentation, it was actually my focus point. And for the previous part of my presentation is the weak domestic consumption. And since we do have the weak domestic consumption, which was a cost, as I've mentioned, the proportion of household income on the GDP wasn't very low. But we are actually talking about an economy with 1.4 billion population, and with such a big economy, and there will be very huge gaps between the poor and the rich, and we can talk about that whether we have 200 million or 300 million median income population, and we basically have 200 to 300 mid class, and the property will bring great amount of the wealth to those populations. And however, there were still few populations. Well, when we say few, isn't relevant, isn't related to the 1.4 million. So few people can actually get a good benefit from the investing property, and they may feel that they're very rich. However, when we aggregate all this number together and see it in time series, and to compare it with China's own situations without doing the cross-country comparison, it seems that the domestic consumption has been increased in the recent years. However, this observation is actually a very small change. It is actually a very slight increase of domestic consumption, and my opinion is that this kind of increase is not big enough to solve the weak domestic consumption issue. And as well as we still have a low percentage of household income against the GDP, there is no way that we can solve this weak domestic consumption issue. And we are seeing some small increase. It's only a slight increase, and this kind of increase are not strong enough to solve the whole issue. And that may come back to the big differences between the poor and the rich. And we have 200 to 300 million mid class or upper middle class. And so that means that we already do have some rich people. And however, it's only a few populations, and when we only check about their conditions, it seems like that they are very rich. For example, it's your first time to come to China, you only visit Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, and you may think that China is a very rich country, but what you do not know is it's only a small part of China. And if you truly want to have a very strong domestic consumption, which is strong enough to drive the overall economy, and you really need to solve that there's a huge gap between the poor and the rich. And I just not talking about that in rural areas, the high school penetration ratio is still very low, and in any big cities like Beijing, you are going to see several millions of immigrant workers, and those immigrant workers, their children are not qualified to go to the high school in Beijing. So when we are talking about institutional issues, that is the institutional issues that we're talking about.
How could you really make them into second citizen whose offsprings cannot receive middle school education in the cities? Serious problems like this may lead to the low income for a very large group of people. To address these problems, there are many things to answer. First of all, a deep cut on the test, so that most of the income may fall into the pockets of the families. On the other hand, the government expenditures should give more preference to the middle school education. the revenue of the Chinese government is very high, but the percentage of such revenue contributed to the school is very small.
I mean, clearly, you only have to drive out of Beijing for 2 hours, out into Huairou, and you go back to 1990, and everybody's still wearing their Jiefengjun and it's, you know, it doesn't feel like it's changed there very much in 25 years. Is there any way that innovation, AI, robotics can try and bridge that gap without hukou reform?
So this is very important. Whether the consumption will become an important driver for China's consumption or a sustained driver for China's economic growth. In recent years, that contribution contributes more to the economic growth, but the root problem, just like Professor mentioned, if the citizens' income is not high enough, or in the asset allocation, there is no guarantee for the pension, and it's not possible to sustain the consumption. And I'm less pessimistic than the professor, and we are very optimistic. In a politically stable society, we just want to live the good days one after another. There is still a strong growth driver for the consumption. And you live in Huairou, you know, it is a small town. Young people living in the tier 3, tier 4 cities have a larger consumption. And they are relatively low income, but very stable income. And they use terminals, internet. They have time to spend money. But you know, according to the biggest consumer of the imported milk powder is the town young people, and it is the town young people or the town small village females buy most of the cosmetics from the internet. It is a great change on the consumption pattern, very profound one. Just now you mentioned AI, robotics, and the new generation of the information technology and its impact on the future society. It not only changes our way of life, it not only changes our communication and how we are respond to the different problems, and also it influences how the information is conveyed, and to some degree it is influencing the connection between the citizens and the government, as well as the communication interaction between different stakeholders within the society. And this is a very profound problem. I think that with its nature, the Chinese people want to try new things, new technology. Therefore, in China, give you one example, AI. I do see a research from Google. You know that many Chinese users cannot use Google. If you Google AI, you know the most requests are from China. Therefore, how popular AI is in China. So many people really focus on AI in China. And when we mentioned the four great inventions, several of them are relevant to the consumption. In the digital times, the way people communicate with each other, how we consume the material and the spiritual wealth are going through many changes. From this sense, China is no different from other countries. We all fall into the same rule of development. So my view is that a new pattern consumption and using the new technology, the high quality product and the service, and the Chinese people also want them. The big problem is the China's market mechanism, whether we can see a deepened reform, whether we can have a better supplier, and to give you better quality products, and the representative of the new economy, whether their power is large enough to become new drivers for China's sustained economy. And I quite agree with what Mr. Wang mentioned, that China's upgraded consumption will be an important growth driver for China's economy. And the wealth effects such as real estate, the stock markets, have a great impact on the consumption in 2015 before the stock crisis. In the first half of 2015, the luxury segment of the automotive sells quite good, and it is relevant to the rising price of the stock market. On the other hand, if the real estate or the stock market have a big adjustment, may have some impact on the consumption. I should say the wealth of the citizens of China are growing. Therefore, it will drive up the consumption of China. The other thing is the debt. It is true the debt ratio of China is quite high, but I think that the Chinese citizens, the household sector debt is quite low. It is only 40%, less than 40%. In comparison to USA or EU, China's household debt is quite low. And last year, the people in China bought the houses, and it is transferred the leverage to the households. Last year, the leverage is extended. Even though it is extended, if we look at the latest statistics, still lower than that of the other countries. I believe that at least we have the potential for growth. Not long ago, I joined a startup forum for the post-1990s. We do see their way of startup company, and also the way of consumption is different. I'm born after 1970s, and these post-1990s discussing the startup business, it is a lot of inspiration for us. Mr. Wang mentioned these new village young people whose parents are post-90s, post-80s, are quite different from what we had. And though China's demographic changes are underway, but generally speaking, China's consumption will of course grow, but also see a new structure of consumption. I believe they will drive up consumption.
A final question about household debt, actually. One of the things that we've been looking at internally at The Economist is the growth of household sector debt. So while at the moment I think that the last BIS figures, it was around 44% of GDP, but there's every reason to think that it will grow to about 50% of GDP by the end of this year. Now that's still not very high by global terms, but what it looks like is happening is we're seeing a shift of debt from the corporate sector to the household sector, and that's propping up growth. Is that something you're seeing, and is it something that you're worried about? Something we've been talking about internally?
Of course, it is a good trend, just like I described for you. As long as there is no fundamental change in income, there is a ceiling there. When there is no change in your income, the variation in the consumption actually is the adjustment between the consumption and the savings. You want to address this problem, you need to push up his income. And just now you mentioned the different generations of people. The younger generation spend more money, and what makes them spend more money? Because they have less savings. When we look at the problem in a broader sense, more income and less saving, and he will spend more. And I want to talk about another thing relevant to it. When we talked about the real estate pricing up and the people earn their wealth from real estate, it's fully concentrated in most of the Tier 1 and part of the Tier 2 cities. If you look at the other part of the Tier 2, all the Tier 3 and Tier 4 cities is another story. Why? We must ask this question, why? Why in other Tier 2 cities and all the Tier 3, Tier 4 cities, there is another story of Tier 3 and Tier 4, and the direct reason is relevant to the low income, is also relevant to the unbalanced or discrepancy of the income, because the relatively wealthy people concentrated in Tier 1 and the part of Tier 2 after living, after them, and the relatively income of the others are quite low. If you want to address the overall problem, tier 3, tier 4, part of the tier 2, no matter it is the population base or the economy size, it's very big. If we cannot address this big problem, you can't address the growth of China economy. No matter how good your technology is, you can't address China's economic problem because still a large number of the population live in tier 3, tier 4, and a part of the tier 2 cities. How to address them, and it is directly relevant to their income. And on one hand, we need to have a deep cut on income. On the other hand, the private corporate should be more vitalized, and the cut of the tax is relevant to the personal income tax and the consumption tax. On the other hand, is the tax given to the private sector. For example, if you have a large burden on the private sector, they can't make money. Private sector cannot pay the salary, right? Another big part is that in recent years, we see all kinds of rules that every employees must pay as a pensions, such as the social pension funds for the every employees, and the percentage is so high, even higher than the Nordic countries. The Nordic countries is a universal welfare, but in China, the welfare is so low, but the government asks for a higher percentage or contribution from the companies. So it is a very deep imbalance, and the result is that the real income of the people is so low. I want to make one more remark. In recent years, we know that the private sector's investment goes down. It is a serious challenge. If most of the investment is from the government or government dominance, the return on that is the efficiency of the return is in doubt. Why the private sector stops investing? Because investment doesn't bring return at all, because I bring so much. It's not that I can make a lot of money. Therefore, people find it difficult to make investment. Why? It is decided by the transitional problem of the companies, like Professor Xu mentioned, the constraints of the labor system, and also a group of the entrepreneurs' vision and entrepreneurship need to be more, and because no return, no investment. Secondly, the central government keep emphasizing that in the ownership system should be further enhanced, especially how to protect the property ownership for the private sectors. What are the laws are available to protect them, and how much rights the private sectors can protect and decide the future of their companies. And there's still a question mark there. Maybe, just like Professor mentioned, our reform is a very grand topic. We can't simply rely on an individual, a single ministry can promote the reform. We need a bottom-up, top-down and a bottom-up process to deepen the reform, so that China can really overcome the mid-income trap and to become a bigger country.
Asked to wrap up at 6, and we've gone a little bit over time. I'm sure we could keep talking for a long time because there's so many problems and opportunities to discuss. But thanks everybody for attending and listening to us today.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists, and a particular thanks to Rachel for a wonderful moderating of this interesting panel. To sum up, today we looked at China's economic growth, its past, its present, and its future, how it compares and how it impacts Asian economies, such as Japan. And we've also taken a look at what's happening right now in China, from rising costs especially real estate, to consumption trends, environmental concerns that Professor Gan mentioned, and innovation drivers that were brought up in all three sessions, including artificial intelligence and robotics. We have looked at the growth model in China today and the kind of reforms that are needed, particularly upgrading in every possible way. I would like to once again thank all of our wonderful speakers today for the insights they've shared, and to all of you for attending this wonderful event, and to everybody online for watching. Also like to take this opportunity to thank FESCO, China Britain Business Council, and the British Chamber of Commerce.
那么到这里呢，今天的论坛呢就全部结束了。再一次感谢大家。
Thank you very much. Thank you for being with us for this afternoon. Thank you for our partners for your support. And after this symposium, we leave 30 minutes for you, and so that you can have more communication with our speakers. I hope that you find the session very fruitful and productive, and we look forward to see you soon in the next time. Thank you.